Hello, let's talk about Shirley Jackson's 1959 novel, The Haunting of Hill House, described by someone no less eminent than Stephen King as one of the greatest ghost stories ever told. Don't know about that, but then again, I don't know how favorite Shirley Jackson is of mine and how much I'm into horror stories in the first place. I'm a mere dabbler in the field, even though I definitely recognize the bones on this thing that obviously went on to influence a lot of people. Shirley Jackson, American horror and mystery author, 6 novels, 200 short stories, born in 1916, died in 1965 at the age of 48 from heart problems. A contributor to the New Yorker, where she actually contributed probably her most famous short story, The Lottery, which has that very kind of cool, precise, disquieting tone to it, which is the thing that I think makes me respect Shirley Jackson, but maybe not embrace her. In that I can always feel her working behind the scenes, not really sure what the hell she's doing, but it just creeping on up on you like it does in The Lottery, like it does in this story, where a group of individuals get together to do a paranormal study of what is reportedly a haunted house. And you know it's this is something apparently was inspired from a description of 19th century report of a haunted house, where she found a lot of kind of very earnest individuals, uh, which she felt were misguided, certainly determined people with their differing motivations and backgrounds. So already you can see sort of the skeptic in there, yet at the same time, with the skepticism, and she definitely has this in her background with exposures to people like in Christian Science and stuff like that, people who believe in all this stuff, oftentimes to their own great detriment. She also said, "I have to believe in ghosts," which if she's settling down to write a ghost story, I have to believe in ghosts, which I do, or I have to write another kind of novel altogether. So there's this uneasy kind of a balance here of the psychological combined with the is what's going on in this fictitious house. What, is it all in the minds of the people, or there's a part of it which very much seems to believe in it. So I listened to this on audio, Blackstone audio, read very ably by Bernadette Dunn, who does a good job of not over dramatizing the work. I think you could go really like whoa, but no, it's like Jackson's prose is very controlled, and that's a part of what gives it its disquiet. And this is a very controlled reading of this book. There are 4 main characters. There's Dr. John Montague, a professor investigator, who's the one who's invited, especially the 2 young women of the story to this thing. And yes, so he's doing the study. There's Luke Sanderson, who is the young heir to the house, kind of a blank, kind of rather bland young man. Sort of like he happens to be the young man on the scene. I don't note anything particularly special about him. Just as there's not, Dr. John Montague is very much kind of like a meh, he's the professor type that you have in these sorts of stories. He gets a little bit more interesting later when his wife appears. Then we have the two young women. There's Theodora, she's described outside of the story. She's described as kind of a bohemian wild girl. It's sort of hard to tell, reading this in 2022, that she's supposed to be the kind of the wild child, the naughty one. It's sort of hard to tell. She seems like a very kind of standard young lady who likes kind of flirting with Luke and the doctor and saying kind of slightly naughty things, but it seems pretty tame by today's standards. I think if you see how tightly wound these people, you can see that like maybe there's a little bit more transgressive. Um, then there's Eleanor Vance, who is a shy young woman who has spent the majority of her life caring for an invalid mother, and now that her mother is dead, is being kind of rather infantilized by her. I think it's her sister and the husband, who sort of take, like, she owns a car. There's an argument at the beginning of like, well, she owns half the car, but they're not going to let her actually use the car. It's like, no, we need it for something. It's like, well, it's half mine, why can't I use it? And indeed, she ends up taking the car and accepting Dr. Morgan Montague's invitation and going to this strange hill house for the thing. They're greeted they're greeted by Mr. The caretakers there, Mr. and Mrs. Dudley. Mr. Dudley, who does the kind of the prototypical. This is where I really noticed the prototypical stuff. He does the prototypical warning to the visitors. It's like, warning, you're coming to a terrible place, and this is your chance to turn back. You have to be given this, and it's kind of this almost real ritualistic thing of, you have to be given a chance to go back. And indeed, the characters seem to notice, like, this is my point of choice, and stuff like that, which really reminded me of the scene in Cabin in the Woods, where this is more explicated, that they have to be given the warning before. So that's a part of the ritual that happens. And then, yes, there's Mrs. Dudley, who's the grumpy housekeeper who won't be in the house won't be in the house at night. And it's yet another warning. Also, maybe possibly she's fiddling with stuff, so maybe she is messing with them. Who knows? Also in the story, later in the story, we get Mrs. Montague, Dr. Montague's wife, and the fellow who drives her up, Arthur Parker, a headmaster of probably a sporty headmaster who makes the milksops of his school lives miserable, and knocks them about until they become real men, and calls Luke a coward. So, but this story, the real center of this story is around the two girls, and the two young women, not girls, but they're very much that 50s way of, their kind of, they're like in their 30s, but they're treated like they're like young teenagers. And indeed, some ways they kind of act like that. There's that kind of standards. And as we go along, they have this very intense relationship. You almost wonder if if it does have hints of like, we're going to be together always, sort of, instead of intense friendship, you get the kind of intense, maybe suppressed sexuality going on there. And there's even a little bit of what seems like a love triangle between the two young women, and Luke, who is, the available young hunk to have on hand for that sort of stuff. But the great thing about the novel is, as it goes on, it becomes more and more about Eleanor, and Eleanor being an unstable, vulnerable woman who has guilts, and starts hearing voices of maybe her dead mother coming from the building, and starts getting possessed maybe more and more by this house. The house itself, which is, the cliche is a character in the novel itself. And we hear about its construction, where it seems to have been constructed very purposely by the originators of it to disquiet, to throw people off balance. And how it's had an unhappy history right from the very beginning, of the newlyweds coming, and the wife dying, crashing into a tree before she even actually reached the house itself, and it just going badly from there. There being warring sisters in the history of the house, and how this seems to all kind of close in and start to warp and manipulate the four main characters of Montague, Luke, Eleanor, and Theodora. And the sort of a weird, sort of a semi-twinning of Eleanor and Theodora, of like, Theodora ends up not being able to use her clothes and having to wear Eleanor's clothes. There's just all these things. It gets very claustrophobic, gets very like cut out of time. They lose track of time. The doctor's wife is supposed to arrive on Saturday, but they lose track of like when Saturday, and are indeed surprised when she and Arthur suddenly do show up. And it's like, oh well, we didn't know. Is it that today? And you get that sense in yourself of like, the days just start blending in with each other. That whole thing of going to an isolated place, where for them, it's they don't have the newspaper or mail coming, versus like, us would be like, there's no internet here, oh my god. And it's like that kind of thing of being in an isolated space and lost in time. Also, the house being, um getting, it's all designed to basically confuse you. You get lost in the place. You can't figure out which way you're supposed to turn. The doors are continually shutting, so it's everything is segmented, and that's kind of reflected in the actual text itself. This is divided into chapters, but in each chapter it's also divided further into like one, two, three, four, fives, or one, two, three, four, or one, two, three, four, five, six, and it's got that kind of claustrophobic feel just within kind of the structuring of the text, and the breaking up of scenes and a kind of disjointedness, which definitely puts you on edge. You know, it does especially at the beginning of listening to it, and it took me a while because I was doing this on short walks each day. It was a bit dry. It was a bit like, okay, I'm starting not to like these people more and more as you go along, as they get more and more stressed and more lashing out at each other. But it gets to a certain point, and then suddenly you're really centering in on Eleanor and her kind of just getting twisted and getting losing herself, losing her dignity. There's a scene where she's like, I want to come and live with you, Theodore. And Theodore's like, why would you come and live with me? It's like, kind of get away. And you kind of feel the kind of the, oh, why are you doing that kind of for yourself? But you also feel slightly kind of, I at least felt more and more sympathy for Eleanor as we go along. It's like, oh, don't do that. But oh, I kind of know that being rejected, not feeling like anyone wants you. That this might be me bringing my own stuff into it, but really kind of really getting into her. I think you sink more and more. It's like the other characters start falling away, and it becomes all about her, and it becomes all in her perspective, and that's when you get the finale, and suddenly you're done and you're out of the story. So it's Shirley Jackson is just, it's one of these authors of like, how do you do this? Because you've kind of brought us from being like, four people who are like, you're like, okay, I kind of know them, just like slowly narrowing down, while at the same time as you getting more and more focused, it's also getting more and more confusing, more and more disjointed. It's really a good performance there. I mean, I really am, I think, more invested in the psychological elements of this story than the horror elements of the story. I never felt afraid. I felt more concerned for Eleanor. I felt more like, oh, sure, you're losing her, kind of that kind of sense of things, of her going off the deep end in a way. Is the psychological horror, which is definitely what kind of resonates here far more than what, and maybe the psychological kind of hysteria of these four people all getting kind of just lost in this thing, because definitely the other tertiary characters do not share in this kind of getting sucked into the house. They remain on the outside, and they may serve as a good kind of ballast for, oh, whatever the people inside are seeing. The people on the outside, it's like, that's none of that happened, or nothing that they perceived like that happened. So yeah, that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. I can see why it lasts, even if I'm never like I'm a super fan of Shirley Jackson. I can see why a book like this would last, because it is so finely crafted, and it so expertly does suck you in. And I mean, just talking about it, I'm like, oh yeah, because like, is this kind of dry? It was like, no, by the end, it's not dry. It just feels dry at the beginning, but once you get into it, once you get to that point of Eleanor, your eye was really into it. All right. That's my thoughts on The Haunting of Hill House. I've been Jay. More videos later.